And if we don't have those services support available for young people in those circumstances, many of them will end up in the system.
All that talk to my gang pull up, and we pull up and they all dip.
Alright, yo, it's your boy King Dave here. This is the Fallon Show. Hope all is going well out there. How about you introduce yourself, brother, and what you do for a living?
Yeah, thanks, brother. My name's Stephanne. I'm an associate professor of forensic psychology. I'm based at Swinburne University in Melbourne. And so forensic psychology, it's the intersection of mental health and the criminal justice system. And my research has looked at a number of things. So pathways into the youth justice system, what are some of the main factors and how that differs for different cultural groups. I also look at how services can work more effectively with young people. What kind of support should they be offering? I also work as well and advise for a number of not-for-profit organisations out in Melbourne, out in the southeast, and some in the west that work with young culturally linguistically diverse young people who have been justice involved. So yeah, that's me at the moment.
Far out, solid work, brother. Solid work that you're doing there. Much love, man, for jumping on. So on this show, I get a whole variety of people on. I try to give people a wider perspective of the system as a whole, not just from convicts, not just from just a whole range of people, so that we can really get an idea of what's going on, especially over there in Melbourne. To start off, so how did you even get involved in all of this, brother?
Yeah, bro, I've been at university or working at a university for more than a decade now. It was a pretty long journey, actually, and probably a bit of an accident and quite a bit of luck as well. So I wasn't someone who grew up thinking about being a professor as a kid. I suppose a lot of kids don't sort of have that sort of front and center anyway, or that particular job. And it wasn't sort of on the table. Even as a young adult, it wasn't something that was in the realm of possibility for me. So, when I grew up, I wanted to be a musician or a sports person. And I was fixated on those two options for a long time, well into my mid-20s. I played a lot of basketball, and I got into sort of powerlifting and strongman events, and then into the fighting sports. Did quite a lot of boxing and MMA, wrestling, and so on. And so I was much more invested in those pursuits, well into my sort of mid to late 20s even. And I actually also was a bit of a musician as well, so I could play a few instruments and composed a bit of music and so on. I also had a bit of a brief stint as a rapper in the late 90s, performing in nightclubs. Performing in nightclubs out in Ringwood, brother. Yeah, but I actually didn't really get my shit together until my late 20s, bro. So from 18 to 27, I was pretty idle. I had an attempt at university when I was 18. Only lasted a couple of months, and then I dropped out of that. I wasn't quite ready for that adjustment. I wasn't sort of in the right headspace. I was living out in the southeast. I was based in Clayton, and a lot of that time I was doing sort of part-time, jobs, a lot of factory work out in sort of Dandenong, Hampton Park area. And then I started to move into security, and by mid-20s, my regular gig was just sort of bouncing at nightclubs around Melbourne. So, and then sort of over time, things sort of unraveled a bit and got into a bit of a slump. And suddenly, late 20s, I hadn't held down a full-time job and just doing bits and pieces. And a career wasn't really looking likely either. So I was getting a bit frustrated with life and started to become a bit disconnected, and things sort of went downhill a little bit from there. But despite that sort of disappointing decade, I did manage to stay connected to education for some of that period. And in doing so, that gave me a lifeline back in my, in my later 20s. So I went back to uni. And so I knocked off a bachelor's degree over time. Took a while, but I majored in criminology. Now, at the time, I wasn't that necessarily sort of passionate about the subject matter, but it was interesting enough, and I was curious. And when I finished that degree, I started to look for jobs in the industry, but there wasn't a lot on offer at the time. So then I enrolled in a master's, and that was a master's of communication. So basically, this focused on how to write and produce media content. So it was effectively a journalism degree. To cut a long story short, I was 27. I had 2 degrees, and I wasn't sort of under my belt, but I wasn't working, and I hadn't been able to hold down a full-time job. Eventually in 2009, I was 28. I got a bit of a lifeline. So I'd moved back home with my folks because I wasn't able to afford rent, and I had a bit of a failed marriage at that point. So I was living back at home, and I'd stopped security as well. So I wasn't working, and I didn't have an income. So I was sort of on the dole and hibernating at my parents' house. And then the old man came into my room one day with a newspaper job opportunity that he'd circled, and he'd often do that. And I'd often ignore it, but he'd bring it in, and he came in and said, look, I think you should apply for this. It's right up your alley. So I had a look. It was Monash Uni. They were offering a PhD to study or to conduct research on young people from multicultural backgrounds who were in custody in Victoria. And it came with a scholarship, 3-year scholarship. So I looked at that, and I had two emotions. The first one was, that's perfect. That's interesting. I'd actually love to do that. But the other thought was, well, you're not getting that. Why would they hire you? You're a bit of a bum. Why would you bother? I got around to calling them. And to my surprise, they just said, look, and I told them I hadn't been very active. And they said, look, come in for an interview. We'll see what happens. And then I thought, I've got to prepare for this. I got overwhelmed pretty quickly because I never had a CV or a resume. I didn't have any referees, like professional referees, and I didn't own any professional clothes. I had one suit from about 2 years ago that my dad bought for a court appearance, but that suit was way too big.
Hanging a bit loose, huh?
Yeah, it was, man. I was doing, sort of powerlifting and that when I bought that, and then I'd lost a lot of weight doing, MMA wrestling, so didn't fit. So I ended up going to the interview in my old bouncer outfit, just the black jeans and the black t-shirt, and I had long hair at the time. I had a big plait going down the back, and I had a fair few tats, which quite a few I've removed now. But anyway, I turned up. I looked a bit of a mess, and the interview was a bit unremarkable, and I didn't have much to say. And at the end, I was 100% certain that I wasn't getting it, and so forgot about it. But then a month later, I got a call from the person that convened the interview, and I thought they were just calling me to tell me I didn't get it. But I remember the call, still vividly, and they just said they were willing to take a chance on me, and so that's when it all changed for me. So, and the rest is history. And that was a bit of a ramble, bro. But I've been in academia ever since. It's been more than a decade. I've got to travel around the world, and I'm enjoying it still.
Oh, man, that's a cool story though, brother, coming from, bouncing and security and, rapping, and, I'm sure growing up out in the eastern suburbs would have been tough as well as, a brown man, black man, it would have been, that would have had the challenges, in itself. But you come, man, you came a long way actually, it shows people it's never too late to start studying, never too late to, go to uni and try that, academic route. So what did that job entail, brother? So was that going down to Parkville there, was it? And into youth justice?
Yep. Yeah, that's right. So a lot of at least for that first doctoral project, so the project needed someone to go in and conduct interviews with every single young person in there, just so they could tell their life story, some of the challenges they've had. What was their initial contact with the justice system like, and what impact did that have on their lives and further entanglement in the system? So interesting project, went for about 3 years, and basically interviewed most kids that were probably in Parkville and Malmesbury those particular years. And so I'd spend a lot of time in there, hanging out on the units, doing those interviews. So that was I enjoyed that, because a lot of academic work, you're sitting behind a computer, man, like you're running, crunching and, data, doing statistical analyses. You get quite disconnected from what's happening on the ground. And so that I like to pride myself as an academic who goes out in the community.
Oh, wow. Again, man, that's a long way from bouncing and MMA fighting, brother. Going to teaching students and all of that. Going back to your time at Youth Justice, brother, having to interview clients there, which is what they call, inmates. So clients, like, what were some, if you can speak on it, what were some sort of common threads there, brother, like in their stories, and what had led them to being in youth justice? And because it's obviously, before you go to youth justice for a kid, there's a long story usually of why they've ended up there. Really, does it just happen, out of nowhere, but that does happen. It can happen out of nowhere sometimes, but usually there is quite a lead up. So what were some common threads, brother, in the stories of, clients in youth justice?
Yeah, bro. And I'd be keen too to get your thoughts on this as well. So basically, the profiles of kids that justice involved, regardless of their cultural background, are kind of similar in many ways. You just alluded to. So you get a sense of social marginalisation, sort of a sense of social rejection from mainstream society. It's financial disadvantage. So a lot of kids coming from low income backgrounds. That's a big one, and also a bit of family breakdown in there as well. A lot of tension in the house. Not everyone, of course, but that came out quite a lot. Tension in the house, a bit of conflict, some violence in the family environment or in and around it, and also detachment from school was pretty common. And sort of fairly early on too, starting to become disconnected from school, 13, 14. And once they become disconnected and there's not a lot of supports in the school system, then disconnection from that institution can sort of lead to a whole range of other things. I'll get to that in a moment. But then substance use was something that came up a lot. Also mental health concerns to some extent, but also peer group as well. Like peer group was often influential in decision making and behavioural dynamics for the young people. So, these factors are all pretty obvious to most people, wouldn't be news to most people. But I was looking also at differences between cultural groups as well. What we identified that called youth, so the culturally linguistically diverse youth who were locked up, they tended to have, just on average, their parents were less likely to be involved in the system than, say, Anglo-Australians who had been in the system, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who had been in the system, who are more likely to have family members that have been locked up or had some justice involvement. So we didn't see that as much with the culturally linguistically diverse population. Second thing we saw, and again, this is just, I'm generalising here, there are exceptions, of course, and we've seen trends change a little bit in recent years, but we saw evidence of later onset engagement in the criminal justice system. So with that culturally linguistically diverse population starting to get involved slightly later, maybe 14, 15, possibly later. Whereas again, some of the Anglo kids who have been justice involved, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids who have been justice involved, their entanglement in the system was slightly earlier, sort of 10, 11, right? So we saw a slight delayed onset. Still not quite sure why that is. We did find that the called group tended to have slightly more pro-social influences in their life and parents that were less likely to be involved in the justice system. There might have been a slight protective buffer just for some of those years. We found a lot of the called kids were still going to church, were still involved in sports or still playing music or something along those lines, even as they were getting locked up. And then the peer group as well. We also found that, and again, this is common for most kids who are justice involved, the peer group is quite influential, but we found for the called group, it was at a magnitude higher. So, the social environment with the group would often dictate, certain types of behaviour and so on. We found that was much stronger for called young people, because when they were embarking on that pathway, a lot of the offending was at a group level, right, as opposed to at an individual level. So the peer group influence was quite strong. But I'd say by and large, the profiles are pretty similar. We just found these sort of minor nuances. If you're in some of those tough social circumstances, family breakdown, conflict, financial struggles, unstable housing, not a lot of monitoring, guidance or support, not a lot of assistance with schooling or trying to stay in school, and not a lot of role models around. It's not surprising that some of the kids will start reacting to that condition. And once you start to deviate a bit from, school and family, and you're feeling a bit socially rejected at that point, obviously you're going to start looking for belonging and meaning and purpose elsewhere. And it's a bit of a cliche, but when you get a lot of young disconnected men and they're not involved in any positive activities, you're going to see some offending, but it'll be offending for social connection, offending for belonging. And then offending becomes the way in which you start to get some status among your mates. It's how you get excitement. It's how you get respect. It's how you get some money. It's also how you prove yourself. You get a bit of clout, get a bit of notoriety. And you get a bit of a buzz from that, right? Because there's always a bit of a thrill when you're planning something. And especially if you're getting away with it too, you get a real rush. And for a crew or whatever, a group, it's a real bonding exercise. And I also just want to say, bro, I think the social media, internet culture is probably amplifying some of that now, because I didn't see that as much with the group back in Parkville 210, 213, but I'm seeing it a lot now. A lot of kids are spending time on social media and they're getting fed a kind of sort of fantasy lifestyle. And you start to want certain things and you attach that to your own self-worth. And I think a lot of young people now are sort of performing what I'd call their notoriety online in order to get some validation from their peers.
But you know, like with your time in youth justice, was it tough, bro, working there and sort of hearing all these different stories and feeling like, you know, sort of seeing some of these kids like, man, these kids are gonna end up in prison and they're most likely gonna end up spending a large majority of their adult lives in prison, you know, like, so was that sort of tough, you know, sort of being able to see that, you know, and
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. It was tough. And I should say back then it was a more accessible population. So the facility is different now. It's a bit
yeah, so it's
chaotic.
completely changed now.
Yeah, yeah, it has, man. It's probably mismanaged. Is probably what I call it. Population's probably more than it was 10 years ago. So you can imagine how many people are just stacked on remand right now.
Oh, wow.
It's like,
But is
and
that from
obviously,
the is that from more offending, or is that just from the government cracking down more, or like the police cracking down on, you know, what offenses wouldn't have landed them inside there before are now landing them inside there nowadays? Because that was what was happening with the adult prison system when it was exploding. It wasn't more that people were offending more. It's just that the police and that were just cracking down on things that normally wouldn't have landed someone inside.
yeah, 100%, bro. That's right. And we're still sort of looking into that phenomenon to find out what happened. But I think you're right in the adult prison because they tightened up what you were referring to, the bail laws, after a sort of a political knee-jerk reaction to a serious crime in the community. And I think same thing has probably happened at Parkville. The bail laws were changed, I think, around 2013 to be a lot tighter. And so, you know, we've seen sort of a gradual increase in the number of kids in remand since that bail legislative change. And it was, as you said, man, it was a little sad because there were, I would have thought, a large minority of kids there who I could see were on a trajectory into the adult system, but they also had sort of goals and aspirations that I think they wanted to fulfill that just didn't have the assistance, or support or know how to do it. And they kind of resigned themselves to a particular lifestyle just out of sort of a feeling of hopelessness. If they had the right assistance and the right guidance and some, you know, positive mentors, they could have fulfilled that, you know, aspiration. And sadly, some of them didn't get that support at all. And that's one of the issues sort of post custody, being released without much of a plan and being sent back to the social conditions that sort of led you in there in the first place. And then there's a bit of a sort of a cycle. So yeah, I think for me that was probably the most disturbing part of it. You know, seeing a quite large number of kids, man, who I thought could quite easily turn themselves around if they had the right supports, but the right supports were just not there. And I think one of the issues I've always had is that a lot of the funding in YJ goes to the pointy end. It goes to services around custody or custody and services in and around custody. Very little by comparison goes into the community in terms of early intervention, in terms of reintegration back into the community and having sort of intensive supports using a strengths-based approach. There's very little sort of funding going into that side of things. And I think that's unfortunate.
And yeah, you would have learned a lot, obviously, being there. I mean, yeah, like you said, you know, that is the thing that sucks because a large majority, well, yeah, a very large majority, you know, bravado aside, that do want to do other things then go to jail. I mean, that's the same even in the adult population. You know, there are so many guys that just do want to work and they do want to do this and that, but it's just they get out and then you get lost, you know, and it's just like yeah, you just get lost. There's not many services and things to sort of reintegrate and all of that, and yeah, you just sort of get lost and then they end up, you know, going back to what they know, you know, even though they don't want to go back to prison or juvie, you know, that's just what ends up happening, you know. So but look, so moving on here, so currently, you know, you are a professor at Swinburne. You're doing a lot still, you know, in this space, you know. So I mean, even with some of these organizations that you're working with currently, so what's that like, brother, being out there on the forefront of you know, so you said African Australian type organizations, was it?
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So I'm involved one organisation quite a lot called AfriAusCare out in Dandenong.
Yep.
And that initially was set up to provide sort of support for humanitarian arrivals, sort of resettlement support. But then it sort of evolved into, providing services for young African Australians from that southeast who are at risk, or kids that have come through the system, or kids who are supporting them, their court appearances and so on. And so it started by through the creation of a sort of a basketball-centered approach. So they had this team called the Black Rhinos, which has got a bit of attention, back in Melbourne. And the Black Rhinos is it's a sort of it's a basketball team where they look and training at Dandenong High every week, and any kids can be involved if they want to, but it's sort of a accessible, non-judgmental service. We don't burden kids with sort of paperwork, and it's not based on coercion, or compliance. We're sort of hands off. And so the kids can come and play basketball, but then we have these kind of satellite services around the court. So if they need legal assistance, there'll be a lawyer there. If they need some counselling, there'll be a counsellor there around the court as well. And kids, if they want, they can go off and sort of see or seek assistance from those professionals. There's also, peer-to-peer support. So we have, some older kids there who've been through the system and now, have desisted entirely. And so they're there for support as well. And the CEO, Selba Luca, has a mental health background, practitioner, and so she runs the whole thing. So it's been quite successful. Black Rhinos is, I found to be a good sort of rehabilitative initiative. It's had a lot of success, but I think partly because it's an intimate service, but it's a non-judgmental one, and we allow kids to kind of connect with the service at their own pace. Again, there's no compliance. There's no, if you don't turn up once or twice, well, then you're out. We'll dispense with you. We understand, things take time, and it's all about building trust and rapport. I think that's the key point, particularly with young people who've been justice involved. They've been failed a lot by various sort of institutions, so they're understandably sort of mistrustful. So I've always thought that's the number one thing. You've got to build the trust and rapport, and you've got to earn that as the service provider. And once you've sort of earned that, then you can sort of you can sort of minimize that power imbalance and sort of come to the youth sort of where they're at. And I think I want to see more of these sort of culture-based community organisations sort of being funded to assist some of the young people in the area. So I think with the system at the moment I think it's very much based on what I'd call a deficit model. So there's a very strong focus on what I'd call just harm prevention. There's a very strong focus on risk. Someone's a risk to the community. There's a very strong focus on community safety, and community safety is important, of course. But I think we're skewed. We have a skewed focus on the risk. And the thing is, when you're focused too much on risk, community protection, and nothing else, then inevitably the solutions are going to be behavioural management, containment, coercion, compliance, incapacitation, right? And in a deficit model, I think, always ends up in further deficits. So I always think, and it's much easier for correctional organisations to focus on behavioural management and containment because that's what they do best. That's sort of what they do. The harder work is transitioning to a strength-based model, right? And I can sort of go through what that is. But effectively, it is the opposite of a deficit model, and it really focuses on the person's aspirations and goals and talents, and putting them on a sort of pro-social trajectory, as opposed to just focusing on risk, right? So that's what I think a lot of the culture-based community organisations do very well. They're much more focused on human development, personal development, as opposed to containing risk. But yeah, I think working with those community organisations, man, has been very rewarding. And a lot of the kids that come through there, again, it's a phase in their life, and a lot of them desist when they get provided with those opportunities. So yeah, I'd like to see more of those organisations funded.
Yeah, are there many funded there in Melbourne, brother?
Yes and no. So they most of them rely purely on sort of government funding. There's a little bit of philanthropic funding around, but most of them rely purely on that. But a lot of them tend to be under-resourced. And when there's sort of government funding available, A lot of them will apply and they'll be in competition with each other. And sometimes what will happen is the government will give them a small amount of money each, which is just not enough to function. What would probably be better is if a lot of them collaborated together and worked together as a consortium. But yeah, they generally struggle. But a lot of them are new organisations. They've only been around 4 or 5 years. There's a couple of really good ones in the Pacifica space as well. Out in the West.
All right. Well, brother Stephanne, man, I mean, we're coming to the end now, brother. I mean, is there sort of anything else that you wanted to touch on, brother, and share?
I think what I would say is where we need to go when we're working with young people. I think we need to sort of change our sort of mindset. At least I'm talking from a service provider perspective. I think I mentioned before about having more of a strengths-based model in corrections or in the community. So I think a lot of kids, they stop offending for various reasons, right? They've either had enough, they realise it's not fun anymore, they realise that they're wasting their lives, or they've had a fallout, they've had a wake-up call, they've engaged, they found a bit of purpose and meaning, or have hooked up with a pro-social partner. There's a whole lot of reasons, but not everyone gets there, and it can take a while. But I think what services need to do, they need to think about reconnecting young people, really invested in connecting young people back to their communities, focusing on the aspirational and the educational needs. But you have to incentivize the young person, because I think a lot of kids who are disaffected, who are justice involved, they are having some of their life needs met, through offending, which I mentioned before. They're getting sort of friendship, purpose, meaning, getting a pseudo family out of it, getting some respect, getting some thrills. So if those services want to deviate kids from those lifestyles, they have to provide them or facilitate some of those pro-social opportunities and experiences which replace the needs that they have that are being fulfilled through offending, right? They can't just say, well, stop all of that, it's bad for you. They've got to say, well, I'm going to provide a meaningful alternative. And I think, this is where the aspirational programming that I mentioned before is important, man. Having a strong focus on strengths and the talents of the young person, spending time identifying what they're good at, what do they want to do, and then help and support them pursue that activity. What I've seen in my life, that moving away from crime is very much the result often of relationships that are formed that are not solely about trying to control someone's behavior. And so this is where that sort of trust comes in. But I'll just finish, bro, by saying that, I want to compliment you on this show, brother. I mean, the show is such an important service to the community. I think it provides a voice for people who are not often heard or ignored, and allows those stories to be, told in an unfiltered way and conveyed, shared in a non-judgmental environment. And these conversations that you're having, I think are probably pretty therapeutic for the guests. I don't know possibly if they're therapeutic for you, but possibly, but also for a lot of people watching. And so I think this show, you're actually going to change a lot of lives through this show than most people working in corrections will ever be able to do. And also most people studying this area will ever be able to do. So keep it up, brother. And I'm excited to see the next level.
Man, thank you, brother. I really appreciate the kind words, man. And that's the goal, man. We're just I just feel like we all got a part to play in all of this. That's why I'm getting all these people on here, getting you on here, because we've all got a part to play in this race, man. We've all got the same goal. And like you said, with these different organizations, like we really just needed to try and come together more, and not just these services, but also people, inmates, people that have lived that, bringing us all together and being able to get a wide spectrum of what's going on, and the best ways to go about things. I mean, I really appreciate you jumping on as well, man, because you've actually given me a lot to think on, man. Here in New Zealand, I am trying to do a lot in the space outside of this, working with the youth, working with at-risk youth, even adult offenders, so you've given me a lot to ponder on now, a lot of good tips to sort of with my own journey in doing all of this. So again, man, I appreciate you jumping on, brother. Thank you for the kind words as well, my man. And man, if there's nothing else you'd like to say, brother, we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Likewise, thanks for having me on the show, and all the best, bro.